Good evening, everyone, and good night for some of you further away. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this virtual space for what I'm sure is going to be a really enlightening conversation today. My name is Dr. Carol Payne. I'm a professor of art history in the School for Studies of Art and Culture, and also Associate Dean, Research and International in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Carleton University. And I want to begin this session by acknowledging that Carleton University, and where many of us in this area are located, is on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. As such, Carleton acknowledges it has a responsibility to the Algonquin people and a responsibility to adhere to Algonquin cultural protocols. Much has been said about the continuing and potentially lasting effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the ways in which we think about employment and the workplace. But what about those whose labor was already considered precarious to begin with? With that in mind, tonight's fantastic panel will share with us their research findings on how sex workers across the world were impacted by and also responded to the pandemic. I'm now happy to turn the spotlight over to Michelle Leslie Annett, our moderator for the evening. Michelle is a PhD student in sociology at Carleton University. Over to you, Michelle.
Hi. Before we begin, I would just like to add that there is a separate Q&A section below for anyone who has any questions that they'd like panelists to answer. All questions will be answered at the end of the event. And the order for the speakers this evening, first off, we're starting with Megan Rivers-Moore, who's joining us from Ottawa, and Kate Hardy, who's joining us from Manchester to talk about Latin America and the Caribbean, followed by Luca Stevenson, who's joining us from Marseille to talk about the EU, followed by Prabha Kotiswaran, who's joining us from DC to talk about India. And finally, we have Ryan Conrad, who's joining us from Gatineau, and Emma McKenna, who's joining us from Hamilton to talk about Canada. So I will turn it over to you, Megan and Kate.
Thanks very much, Michelle Leslie. Kate, you're going to share your screen.
Yeah, sure.
Entonces acá nosotros creemos que es súper importante.
Sorry. Okay. See that? Yeah.
Entonces acá nosotros creemos que es súper importante de que la academia trabaje en conjunto con las organizaciones de trabajadoras sexuales, porque sabemos nosotras lo que vivimos, lo que pasamos, cómo nos sentimos. Somos protagonistas de nuestra propia historia.
So when the pandemic hit in March 2020, Megan and I realized that a lot of the women that we'd worked with in Latin America, in Argentina, and Costa Rica and other places would have had no income because of curfews and lockdowns and not being able to work. Obviously, sex work involves very intimate contact with another person. So when there's a pandemic of a contagious virus, that brings another layer of difficulty to the work that they needed to do. So there's a phrase within the sex worker rights movement, which is nothing about us without us. And this comes from a long history of a lot of researchers and other people going to sex workers, extracting data and then using it either against them or not in their interests, or not even simply returning it to them. So it was actually the sex workers who did interviews with their colleagues. And the data that they got was really good. And we got hundreds and hundreds of responses across 12 countries. But it wasn't without risks to the people undertaking it, because obviously they were having to navigate through curfews when you weren't supposed to be in the street, people weren't supposed to be working, so they had to make sure they didn't attract attention to the other women that were working. So they did a really good job, but it was also very brave to be out there and making sure that this information was collected.
E incorporar a las trabajadoras sexuales en su rol de entrevistadora me pareció sumamente importante. Se nos reconoce como sujetas y activos de nuestras luchas, entonces, no solo como un objeto, no como un objeto de estudio, sino que lo cual ha sido la práctica más común de la academia, que siempre investigan, sacan la información de las compañeras y después ni siquiera hay una de vuelta.
Me sigue sorprendiendo todos los días mis compañeras, las capacidades que tienen las compañeras, la fuerza, el compromiso que tenemos con nuestras pares, porque sin haber ido a la universidad, muchas de nosotros apenas tenemos la primaria. Sin embargo, las compañeras se echaron al hombro la investigación, salieron al territorio, descubrimos que a través de las nuevas tecnologías como el internet y todo eso pudimos recabar la información, más allá de no haber salido a la calle muchas veces, pero sí el ingenio, la destreza, pero todo eso no se podía haber hecho sin el compromiso, que esto es muy importante. La investigación que hicimos juntas con la Universidad de Canadá es importante por la razón de que hay que sistematizar las experiencias que hemos adquirido y hay que, sobre todo para hacer incidencia política. Sin datos no podemos hacer incidencia política y nosotras, las trabajadoras sexuales de Latinoamérica y el Caribe, hicimos mucho en el marco del COVID, viendo que los gobiernos miraban para otro lado, y entonces me parece sumamente importante poderlo mostrar.
We have so much to learn from sex workers in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we are very proud of the fact that this project was truly collaborative from start to finish. I think it's a really good example of the possibilities that exist for academics and community groups to work together in generating knowledge that has the potential to be useful and to contribute to improving people's lives.
Thanks for that, Kate. I guess we'll move to the slides next. We wanted to start with a couple of those images from the people that we worked with in Latin America. They didn't want to join us today because the event is in English, obviously, but they sent their greetings, and we just wanted to make sure that you heard from them and got a sense of their voices. Can you put the slides up, Kate?
Oh yeah, can you not see them?
Nope.
No, let me try again. Sorry, it's gone through them. Do now?
Not yet.
Let me stop share and start again. Now?
Yes, thank you. So the results that we're going to talk about today are based on this co-produced project on sex work, COVID-19, and mutual aid. So we worked with Red 3X, which is a regional network of sex worker organizations that kind of coordinates the national organizations in 12 different countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Sex workers, as you saw briefly in that video, sex workers were actually trained in each of the countries, and then they were paid as peer researchers. So the results we're going to talk about today are based on 506 interviews carried out in 12 countries, plus interviews that we did with the leaders of each national organization. So by the middle of 2020, Latin America was actually considered the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. It represented a quarter of all confirmed cases of COVID-19, almost a third of all the deaths related to the virus, even though the region only constitutes 8% of the global population. Quarantine lockdowns in various countries Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru were some of the longest and the most strictly implemented in the world. So what was interesting in that context was almost all of the respondents in this study had to continue working despite the quarantine rules. And that was due to the fact that the majority of them are heads of households, and they simply needed to generate income for their households. So as you can see here, for the majority of the people surveyed, sex work was the main source of income. They covered between 50 and 100% of their household expenses through sex work, and 54% said that their sex work was the only source of income for their household. The way that work was carried out in the region changed substantially for many sex workers. Among the most significant aspects that were reported to us were changes in the kind of spaces and times and forms of sex work, as well as some of the new health protocols. So as you can see here, 55% of respondents reported a reduction in their income. 40% said they were working reduced hours. 30% said they had seen a reduction in the number of clients, and then another 30% also said that they were no longer able to afford to pay for just like basic living expenses, so food, rent, basic services. So some quotes here, just because we wanted to make sure that you heard from some of the respondents. From Paraguay, the truth is I stopped working for a while. I stopped working because I was afraid, had to respect the rules, but then needed to go back. Had to work one way or another because what I had saved up, I'd spent by then. I had to start over. Some sex workers talked to us about turning to other forms of sex work. So here we have a quote from a Brazilian leader who talked about the number of women who started working on the internet really grew. So people selling photos. But to do that kind of work, you have to have access to the internet with high speed. You have to have a space in your house, private space, so you can work. And many people couldn't afford the internet. And then others turn to new forms of income generation. So Azucena, who's a leader in Peru, talked about sex workers selling masks and selling hand sanitizers, right? People just kind of like hustle to make money in the way that they can. And she says, in this crazy time, that was the business. So some sex workers turn to that. The pandemic's restrictions on mobility, had an impact on people's ability to work. So like, for example, in El Salvador, for a while, there was a full suspension of public transportation. In Guatemala, there was a travel ban, which was really hard for some people work, in municipalities that are not the ones that they live in. And so they were stuck and couldn't return to their families. Businesses closed in almost all countries, right? So a lot of sex workers started to turn to look for clients in the streets. There was also the issue of compliance with health protocols to prevent the spread of COVID-19, and that became a real focus for many sex workers. So a lot of them were already, had a lot of expertise about, strategies for HIV prevention, negotiating condom use with clients. But in the context of the pandemic, there were these like additional measures that were required. So they had to purchase more, right? So rather than just purchasing condoms, they were also needing to purchase masks, hand sanitizers, soap. Here we have a respondent from Panama just talking about like the clients know they got to keep their masks on, they got to wash their hands. It's very clear to them. The image on this slide is from lots of sex work organizations in Latin America produce materials like this. This is an example from Paraguay, where they're telling sex workers that the safest position to have sex with a client is doggy style, because you can keep your faces as far apart as possible. So there were various flyers like that they produced to share with their coworkers. Sex workers in Latin America have experienced violence of all kinds for decades. We've got several studies that were authored by Retrosex on that topic in particular. Some of our respondents in this study stated that they hadn't suffered violence from state agents during the pandemic, mainly because they've been out of the street because of these strict public health protocols. But the sex workers who had to find a way to continue to work talked a lot about violence on the part of armed forces and police, and that worsened because of the strict public health controls that were put in place. And that the pandemic sort of provided a new motive or a new justification for the abuse of power and the mistreatment of sex workers, whether they were indoors or on the streets. So lots of sex workers told us stories about being harassed by the police, having to pay bribes. This quote is from Elena Renaga, who you saw in the video, who is she was the executive director of Red Just Sex while we did the project. And she says, that we can see now that having to work clandestinely exposes us completely. Leaves us outside of every system, of every policy. We could see it before, but the pandemic made it so much clearer. It's very clear how the police took advantage of the situation. We had achieved many changes by doing workshops with the police. The Red Just Sex has a long history of doing sort of consciousness raising with the police around sex work. But the laws that were passed to keep people out of the streets because of the pandemic, well, the police have returned. They seem to have forgotten what they learned. What the police have done in the last year and a half, 2 years of pandemic here in Latin America, the police rape women, the police strip them, institutional violence has been exacerbated during the pandemic.
Okay, great, thanks, Megan. So now we just want to talk a bit about how sex workers actually responded collectively to this situation. So the key thing to know is that because sex work is not recognised as work, in every country, sex workers were locked out of systems of provision, even those that sometimes did provide for other informal workers who make up a really big proportion of workers in the region. So while some did, get some form of state aid, it was often just kind of a basket of basic goods. And this wasn't for sex workers. It wasn't aimed or targeted at sex workers. It was just as a result of them being distributed in the communities that they live in. So as Lucy in Paraguay said, for the state, for the government, we don't exist. Our work is not a crime in my country, but we only exist for epidemiology. We exist when they want our vote, but other than that, no, we don't exist. And it's made much more difficult because the restrictions that came from the government were just stay at home. And for sex workers, staying at home means no rent, no food, no services. So our compañeros really had no choice but to go out and work, and this is what generated this institutional violence. So though we were afraid, we still went out in the streets to help our compañeros. And so this was the kind of main thing that sex worker organizations did, was a lot of their offices had to close. So in some cases, they could have people come to the office still, but in most, they actually had to go out into the street and try and identify who was working and find them to offer this support. Something that should be noted is that all of the organizations distributed goods, food baskets, basic food baskets, but often they did it not only for sex workers, but actually for the wider community. And in Latin America, this is actually something that's been fairly common, is that once sex workers have formed organizations and started to, do this sort of mutual aid, which hugely pre-exists and predates COVID, they tended to then also move on and actually support other people, because they tended to recognize that there were other working class people in their communities facing very similar situations to them. And what this had the effect of, in some ways, is combating stigma and kind of showing the role that sex workers can play in society. So Samantha described kind of what they did by saying, we did an internal collection and we just started moving. So they just didn't even wait for the state to respond. We just started doing it. We started sending emails. We looked to see who donated to us before. We reached about 800 compañeras. We delivered dignity kits with sanitary napkins, soap, washcloth, shampoo, and toothbrushes. And then with our own funds, we could give, some food basics. And all of this was so that our compañeras could at least give something basic to give their children. So actually this rapid, this response by sex worker organizations was very quick and rapid, because they're actually used to responding to, health crises. That's where a lot of their expertise comes from. They've spent a lot of time engaging in HIV prevention. They spent a lot of time supporting each other through mutual aid. So it meant they could very quickly change what they did and reorientate it. And that meant they've helped thousands of people across Latin America and the Caribbean. So they also played a really important role in preventing the spread of COVID by offering these kind of preventative measures, and had a wider community impact. The other thing that's really interesting is that they actually started to develop new links between street and online workers. So traditionally, retrosex has tended to work solely with street workers, but as some people, a small number, started to shift online, those kind of boundaries reduced, and there was kind of new solidarities between them. And so I guess there's a question here if there are future implications of these new bonds of solidarity that emerged during the pandemic. Okay, so just briefly by way of conclusion, the pandemic, probably as we'll hear in all regions of the world, had a really severe impact on sex workers in Latin America, namely because they are informal and unrecognized workers. A key thing that came out of our study, we did 2 waves of data collection. Well, I say we, the workers in Latin America actually did those, but we did 2. And we actually found that the situation was getting worse through 2021. And that was the situation in Latin America, deteriorated, but specifically sex workers were reporting lower levels of income, declining income, and worse outcomes. So the reason we think that this kind of response could be so effective and so quick, as I said, is that they have a lot of embodied experience in responding to other pandemics, including HIV pandemic. So really what we kind of want to argue and point out is that in this context, sex workers were either partially or completely abandoned by the state. There was just very little state response to supporting sex workers and their families. And so what this kind of organization and mutual aid shows is this really key example of collective action, solidarity and mutual aid, which I think we could learn a lot from. So as one of the leaders said, just to finish with their words, like Megan began with them at the beginning, we're very, very committed to the cause. We're militants. We're the voice of all sex workers in my country. But we know that we're going to carry on because more pandemics may come after all. But what's most important is to trust that the struggle continues.
Thank you so much, Megan and Kate. Next, we will hear from Luca Stevenson.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Luca Stevenson. I work for the European Sex Worker Rights Alliance as Program Director. And I'm going to present about the situation in Europe. And I have a few slides, so I hope this is going to work. It's this one. Is that okay? Up. Are we starting by the conclusion? Okay, so is it okay? So briefly about our organization, we are a sex worker-led regional network, which represents more than 100 organizations in 35 countries in Europe and Central Asia. We are focusing on building capacities of sex workers through trainings, exchange between our members, doing research as well. We did some research on access to justice. We are currently doing one on police violence. And we do a lot of advocacy, in particular with European institutions, but also supporting our members doing national advocacy. So I wanted to start with the role of our network during COVID crisis. So as soon as we started to hear about COVID, we see the impact of COVID on our members in sex workers across the region. We were one of the first networks to develop policy demands that have been then used by different networks, including UNAIDS in particular, recommended that sex workers be included in social and economic support from the state. We developed this research, sex workers in the front line, which is done in consultation with our members, which I'm going to explain a bit more. We organize exchange between our members, like lots of people adapting to working even more online, organizing lots of webinars for our members so they could learn from one another. And then we also were able to obtain some grants, in particular from Open Society Foundation, and were able to directly give grants to different organizations in different countries. I think Greece, UK, Germany, France, and I think Spain as well. So these are two of the statements that we published. The first one, as you can see, very early during the pandemic, statement on COVID and recommendation. And then we also developed a report with SWAN, which is our sister network for Eastern Europe and Central Asia, looking in particular at the impact of the crisis on access to health services. As you can imagine, a lot of health services were shut down or reduced, and this has an impact on sex workers' health, such as sexual health, mental health, etc. So I wanted to start with this story, which I think for me is quite significant. In the early days of the pandemic, so that's in May 2020, we heard of a trans woman in Georgia in Eastern Europe that set herself on fire in front of a building of the state in protest of the state completely not giving any type of assistance to sex workers in the country. And as Kate was saying a minute earlier, this has been the case for most sex workers all across the world. As the pandemic was hitting, as the state was scrambling to offer social and economic support to all workers, sex workers and other informal workers were completely left out from any kind of social support. And this had a really clear direct impact. And as we can see from this woman who thankfully survived, she had no other solution but to really make this protest by setting herself on fire as a way of protesting. And this also showed that the most marginalized sex workers were also the most hardly hit because of lack of saving, for example. So in particular in our region, trans women, migrant sex workers, and racialized sex workers were the most hit. So as was said already, but what we know is that it was really difficult for sex workers without any kind of income support from the state, and had to choose between continue working and then taking risk of getting COVID, taking risk of infecting their family, their children, their clients, etc., or not working and then really facing extreme poverty, destitution, homelessness. So it has, of course, an impact on health when sex workers did get COVID. We know also that there was increased policing. So in many countries, because of lockdown, police would go and arrest sex workers for not respecting lockdown. We also know there was an increase of homelessness. Many sex workers do live and in their place of work. So for example, in Spain, lots of migrant sex workers live in and work in brothels. When the brothels were shut down, they were basically put in the street. And sex worker organization had to negotiate with brothel owner so that sex workers were able to continue staying in the brothel, but at reduced rates because they also have to pay for their accommodation there. We also have evidence of increased violence by various actors, including clients, which also show that a bit similar to the Swedish model, that the situation where there is a decrease of clients actually give more power to the buyer rather than the seller. And then I think what is often less discussed about is the epidemic of mental health issues, including suicide, that took place in the community. So it was really striking. I think a few months after the start of the pandemic, we started to hear a lot of sex workers who commit suicide or try to commit suicide, including close colleagues who work in different organizations. So we published this report called Sex Workers on the Frontline, which was co-written by Boclarca, Federco, and PG Macciotti in consultation with our membership. And you can see here the importance of mutual aid by sex worker community. And as Kate was saying, this is something that sex workers do every day and for decades. Like sex workers have always been there to support one another in time of crisis, when somebody is ill, when somebody needs support with access to housing, etc. But this was very apparent during the pandemic. And in particular, what was kind of ironic is that organizations that are meant to provide services to sex workers were not able to work in the first month of the pandemic because they had to respect lockdown and restriction by the states. And because sex worker organizations often are unfunded or are more flexible, they were actually able to go and continue working. And I think of, for example, like Accept ST in France. You can see here, France Accept ST is one of the rare organizations that is led by migrant trans sex workers. They do an amazing job in France, supporting sex workers, migrant women, etc. for many years. But during the pandemic, they were in the street providing food parcels. They were able to provide 60,000 euro and support 300 mostly trans migrant women in Paris. And that meant that sex workers then didn't have to work or had to work less, then take less risk, and which also had an impact on the contamination rate of COVID. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but what you can see clearly is the number of food voucher, the number of people directly supported. I think the highest number here is from SWARM, the Sex Worker Advocacy Resistance Movement, who managed to obtain £250,000 and were able to distribute to 1,255 people. And you can see there that was really a huge impact on the community. I don't think also like this is comprehensive. This is just the information that we were able to obtain from our members. Oops. Okay, sorry. And I wanted to just also include a few quotes from our members, which show some of the issues that are maybe less talked about. And starting with Poland, actually what's interesting is that even during the pandemic, several states tried to increase criminalization either of sex work or, in this case, of abortion. In Poland, a law proposal was put forward during the pandemic to further criminalize abortion. For sex workers, it was very hard to access morning after pills due to movement restrictions and the delays of appointments with doctor. And these are some of the few issues that are less talked about, which I think are also very important. And this is what Sabrina Sanchez, who at the time was working with Otras and who is now my boss and our director. And she mentioned the housing situation prior to COVID in Spain being already awful for sex workers. The rents are really high in big cities like Barcelona, like in any other gentrified European city. Many sex workers live at their workplace, which were shut down. So basically, sex workers found themselves on the streets. This was the same in many countries where sex work is legal, whether it's like Germany, for example. And to end, this is what Nikki Adams from the English Collective of Prostitutes says. The virus comes on top of a crisis of poverty, especially among women. Most sex workers are mothers, mainly single mothers, who have been made poorer by austerity cuts. 1.5 million people in the UK have been made deliberately destitute by government policies, and 4 million children are living in poverty. That means that hundreds of families in the UK rely on the income from sex work to survive. And I think that's really critical because that was already the situation for sex workers in many countries. As you know, for many people, sex work is the only income available, and often many sex workers live in precarious situations. So the impact of COVID was huge and really led to more poverty and mental health issues, as I was mentioning. But however, not to end on only negative things, I think it's also important to really look at the positive development that occurred because of the COVID crisis and the work that sex workers did. And in particular, we know that, as we've seen earlier in the other slide, that there was an increased level of engagement by sex worker-led organizations with sex workers. So we also published a video where different sex workers talk about the work that they did. And for example, the Italian activist from Comitato mentioned that they reached out to like 1,000 sex workers, which that wouldn't be the case usually. And many of the organizations did so. They really reached out to the community and actually increased the reach, where then more recognized by local sex workers, etc. This actually led to lots of development. I will finish by the national development, but even at the European level, it was interesting. We do a lot of EU policy, and sex workers are really included in any type of EU policy. And for the first time, there was the European Parliament voted on a resolution that urged the Commission to establish a concrete framework for the rights and protection of sex workers during and after a crisis, importance of including measures and strategy to tackle discrimination faced by sex workers in access to funding, housing, healthcare, education, and other services. And this is actually quite important because it's the first time, I believe, that the word sex workers was used by any kind of like EU policy and was voted in Parliament. And even now, as we speak, there is a new proposal developed by the European Commission on violence against women and domestic violence that does recognize sex workers as at higher risk of violence and deserving of specific services. And I believe that this is a direct consequences of the role that sex workers did during the pandemic and the visibility that the organization took. And there were also other developments, such as a higher priority on health from the European Union, the role of community-led services, the European Center for Disease Control, recognizing sex workers as a socially and medically vulnerable group, etc. So in some way, this really led to more visibility and inclusion of sex workers. And I feel like what is the most important is that actually at national level, we saw that there was suddenly further recognition of the role of sex workers. And this is the most evident in Belgium. So I don't know if you follow the development in Belgium, but basically what happened is that the COVID crisis happened, sex worker organization, and in particular UTSOP, which is a sex worker-led group, did a huge amount of work reaching out to sex workers, providing food, providing food parcels, etc. And then started to have like further conversation with the government or the different federal governments in Belgium. And the Belgian government were actually saying like, well, we're not able to really provide a framework to support sex workers because they are such a gray area. So the situation in Belgium is very complex. Sex work is not recognized, but it's tolerated. There is different laws in different cities, etc. And basically, the Belgian government started to have proper conversation with sex workers. What do you need? And the first response was like, we need funding and we need a better legal framework. So what happened is that the Belgian government, in partnership with sex worker-led organization, looked at law reform in Belgium and now came with a proposal to decriminalize sex work, which was passed last year, which was a huge achievement and a recognition of the role of like community-led and sex worker organization in Belgium, but globally. So I think that's where my slides end. And yep, that's it for me. I haven't planned conclusion, but as you can see, despite all the negative, and I think like what the issue is that there are some positive development, but I think in particular the impact of COVID on the mental health of our communities is still something that this was something like when we talk about long COVID on the general health of society. I think in particular for sex workers, there is ongoing challenges that have resulted from the crisis. Sorry, I should stop this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Luca. Our third presentation is Prabha, so I'll turn that over to you, Prabha.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Sorry, yeah. So I just want to, can you hear me? Yep. And you can see the slides or not? No, okay. Okay, I think I'm not able to pull up my notes and okay, great. So just give me a second. And yeah, okay, wonderful. So what I just want to share is, first of all, I think one of the sad things about COVID, obviously, it was the pandemic, and one of the sort of most important leaders of the Indian sex workers movement actually died because of COVID. Dr. Smarji Jana, who was, epidemiologist himself and was played a crucial role in the organization of sex workers in Calcutta. So the thing is, I just want to say that, my presentation actually echoes some of the experiences that, all our presenters have shared so far. So the experience in India is very much similar to that in Latin America because, sex workers form part of the informal economy, and we have a very large informal economy, which is generally quite ignored in all kinds of, policy spaces, and therefore had to rely more on each other and the civil society sector in order to actually meet basic needs. But also interestingly, like Luca said, actually the pandemic was an opening for us to push further towards the path of decriminalization in India. So I'll just say a little bit about, the sort of legal landscape prior to, are you able to see my slides now or? Yeah, okay. So the legal landscape really in the Indian context was that, for a very long time, sex work has been treated as exceptional as in other parts of the world. And there have been many attempts to actually further to import the Swedish model, essentially. So in 2005, we had such an attempt, which was warded off because of the role of sex workers in HIV prevention. And the government realized very quickly that it would be counterproductive to criminalize sex work or customers of sex workers. But we've also had, as a result of quite extensive rape law reforms, we've had new trafficking offenses that have come into the books that mostly shadow, Article 3 of the Palermo Protocol on trafficking. But there was a point at which, there was again almost an attempt to, import the Swedish model in the Indian context. But since 2016, we've had a slew of anti-trafficking bills, each one more dramatic and drastic and carceral than the other, which really try to, not just import the Swedish model, but significantly expand on it. And it's almost a collection of all the worst forms of anti-sex work regulation around the world, which has been brought together in draft forms. So of course, in terms, so there is the legal story, but there is also the story of, large economic shocks. So COVID was obviously a huge economic shock to the sex work sector. But long before that, in 2016, when there was the economic policy of demonetization, where essentially, certain kind of lots of currency were considered not to be tender anymore. So essentially, because sex workers deal so much with cash, all of a sudden they were found that they had no, they'd lost all their savings, all the money that they saved, in the form of cash, they had actually lost. So, so the sex worker community had already been reeling from the effects of demonetization. And when COVID came along, the first sort of response to, COVID was, as others have mentioned, an attempt to essentially shut down red light areas in India in the name of COVID. So there was and this was again, promoted by Harvard and Yale, who set up a study that basically argued. So there were these, quote unquote scientists who had, it wasn't clear that they'd gotten any ethical approvals to, in fact, do this work in the heights of lockdown. But they came up with a report essentially saying that, we had to shut down red light areas in India, otherwise COVID would spread quite dramatically. And the idea seemed to be also the proposal, a very strong proposal from a very unlikely source, a group of doctors to say, or scientists to say that actually, alternate forms of occupation should be made available to sex workers so that they can exit sex work. And so obviously, as you can imagine, there was a huge response to this from the sex workers movement. Both the National Network of Sex Workers as well as the All India Network of Sex Workers wrote a letter to both Harvard and Yale. And I think Yale then initiated an investigation into the study. And thankfully, nothing happened with the study thereafter. But this was sort of the first knee-jerk response to COVID and sex work in India. Of course, then, as others have said, both the national government as well as the state government in India launched, a range of sort of national initiatives for the urban and rural poor. This included unconditional cash transfers, cash transfers to very poor women in their, through direct transfer into their bank accounts, distribution of free food rations, as well as the distribution of food coupons. Now, at the state level, there were certain states where sex workers organizing had been very strong, where they actually had, similar initiatives to say that, irrespective of whether sex workers were staying on in sex work or they were exiting, that they should actually have access to free food, free ration, as we call it, and to all essential services. So in the course of, trying to have more targeted interventions for sex workers, the National Human Rights Commission, so there was a committee that fed recommendations into the National Human Rights Commission that consisted of feminist public health experts. So they initially had a couple of advisories that were very focused on sex workers. And the advisory was that sex workers should be recognized as workers and they should be registered so that they would have workers' benefits. And the advisory also recommended that temporary identity documents be issued to migrant sex workers, because as you can imagine, a lot of their documentation is registered to the home state that they come from. And like many other workers in the informal economy, they're migrating within India to do sex work. So this was initially the advisory from the National Human Rights Commission, but which was then rolled back because of a lot of pressure that came from anti-trafficking organizations. And so we had a much more watered down advisory, a revised advisory from the National Human Rights Commission, which said that, sex workers could have all these benefits, but on humanitarian grounds. So the recognition of them as workers was then, withdrawn essentially. So in terms of research, although, the team that was working as part of our larger project, which is called the Laws of Social Reproduction, we were doing a lot of research on housing rights of sex workers. So we didn't really look at the effect of COVID directly on sex work, but the National Network of Sex Workers did do that. So they interviewed, they conducted a survey of 2,200 women across 8 states. And, the idea was to really see what are the levels of indebtedness among sex workers, how are they managing, what kind of access they have to state assistance and so on. And they actually found, so in an article that the National Network has published, they basically argued very strongly for treating sex workers as being part of the informal economy, and demonstrated that, quite a large, at least half the number of sex workers were also performing some other form of work in the informal economy. and that only half of them were solely doing sex work, which is quite contrary to the impression that people have of sex work in India, which is that everyone, a lot of sex workers work in brothels and red light areas. This is actually not the case. And certainly in the southern half, in southern India, a lot of work is very mobile and related to migration. So what we have is, so this is the kind of research that they did to show that, sex workers were on par with other workers in the informal economy when it came to, the rate of sex workers with bank accounts. 80% of sex workers had ration cards, so they could access food subsidies and so on. And their entire thrust was to show that sex workers were not exceptional in any way. So despite the press coverage in the Indian context, which is very focused on brothel-based sex workers leading very precarious lives, actually the national network showed that the story is much more complicated, and it's a larger sort of intervention into educating people on the nature of sex work in India. So what I now want to do is really share a little bit, so this is a positive part that has emerged from the pandemic, which was that lawyers for the Calcutta-based Durbar Mahila Samanvaya Committee were already part of a large public interest litigation where they had approached, where a panel had been set up to essentially make recommendations on the status of sex work and the kind of law reforms that we would need. So in that ongoing case, lawyers approached the Supreme Court for COVID-related relief. And this precipitated legal developments, which I think can help decriminalize sex work in India. So, as we know, in the context of sex work in India and elsewhere, feminists have often theorized sex work as a form of reproductive labor. But of course, although sex workers themselves also put forth, campaigns for workers' rights, they also have a different way of approaching the state as citizens. So that it's not just about recognizing their sex work as a form of work, but also it's a more fundamental claim to the state to ensure their own social reproduction. So sex work is not just a form of reproductive labor, but it's also claims made by sex workers to maintain their own social reproduction. And obviously these two sets of claims are quite closely interconnected. And we find that in the context of the pandemic, these two dynamics within the movement actually came to the fore. So what we find is that in this particular case, what happens is the committee here had already submitted a report with 10 recommendations, and the recommendations essentially said that sex work should be decriminalized, and that sex workers who wanted to exit sex work should have rehabilitation on their own terms, whereas sex workers who wanted to continue in sex work should be entitled to a life of dignity. So what happens is when, in fact, the lawyers approach the Supreme Court for COVID-related remedies, the Supreme Court went through these 10 recommendations, and the government contested 3 of them, which relates to the decriminalization of sex work. And there's a series of orders that the Supreme Court passed, which are quite significant in relation to the state's duty to provide for the social reproduction of all citizens, particularly sex workers. So I'm just going to quickly see if you're able to. I suspect that I haven't moved the slides. Have you been able to see the slides at all, or?
Didn't see the first one. If you play from start, you could.
Yeah, sorry, just one second. Let me see if I can get back to the screen. Okay, I'm not really able to. Oh, okay, let me try again now. And I think maybe you'll be able to see it now. Here we go. Great, sorry. Okay, so I know I missed some of these slides, but the most important slides are here. So here are the slides. So what is very critical here is that the Supreme Court speaks, this is not just about, what is the legal status of sex work, but it's actually going to the right to food. I'm sorry, I know, Michelle, I'm running out of time, but I'll just quickly go through the slides. And of course, I can share them with you later on. So essentially here, there is it's a very beautiful order. It's a short order, but where the court actually recognizes the pernicious effects of criminalization. And here, the court is saying that actually sex workers don't have access to several of these welfare schemes because of criminalization, which leads to the lack of proof of identity, and therefore the state must do something about this. So they talk about how sex workers have a right to life irrespective of their profession. So this is actually in the Indian constitutional scheme. This is very important because here the Supreme Court is essentially saying that the existing anti-sex work law from now on should be interpreted keeping in mind Article 21 of the Constitution, which guarantees everyone the right to a dignified life, irrespective of their profession, including sex workers. Then the Supreme Court issues directions against violence and detention. So essentially where sex workers are subject to sexual assault, the Supreme Court directs that they not be treated any differently from other women. And very crucially, the Supreme Court also directs the state governments to do a survey of all the protective homes in India where sex workers have been held against their will so that they can be released. And this is a huge victory because a lot of sex workers have been essentially, detained in what is a prison. So this direction is quite critical. The Supreme Court also issued orders on zero tolerance for police abuse and said that, abuse by the police has to stop immediately. So anything like, if sex workers had condoms and so on, possession of those items should not be construed as offenses or evidence of a commission of an offense. They also issued directions to the media to protect the confidentiality of sex workers. They also spoke about sex workers' access to justice and the need for sex workers to have legal literacy and be aware of their rights, and for the judicial system to protect their rights. Finally, they also spoke about how sex workers have the right to live with human dignity. They should have adequate access to nutrition, clothing, shelter, and so on. I guess so what is really important is, although the government disagreed with certain provisions of the report which spoke about decriminalizing sex work, the Supreme Court has very clearly demonstrated that it understands the negative consequences of criminalization. And by upholding the right to life of sex workers, I think has made it very clear that any laws, including anti-trafficking laws, if they get passed, would be subject to constitutional challenge because they would be violating Article 21 of the Constitution. So the pandemic in that sense has been quite beneficial for the sex workers movement in India. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Prabha. And last but not least, we have our final presentation from Ryan and Emma. I just want to extend a kind reminder that if any of you have any questions, just to put them in the Q&A chat and we can answer them after Ryan and Emma's presentation.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay? I have headphones now. Yeah, okay, great. Thanks everyone for speaking thus far, and thanks again to Megan River Morris for organizing this. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background into our project, and then I'll pass it over to Ryan, who will describe the project in more detail, and then we'll move into our results. So in 2020, both my Conrad, Ryan, and I were both volunteering in sex worker organizations in our communities, in our towns. We were both in a position of volunteer, not related to our position in the academy. This was purely just a volunteer role. And we were there, Ryan was in Ottawa at Power, Institutes of Ottawa, Work, Educate, Resist, and I was in Hamilton at SWAP, the Sex Workers Action Project. So when COVID hit, we were both instrumental in our organizations in implementing sex worker mutual aid funds. So we saw this popping up around the country, and our organizations, like most sex worker organizations, were on the front lines of beginning to think about mutual aid, as we heard about folks in South America and the Caribbean. So in our particular organizations, Ryan and I, as well as some other colleagues and comrades, got together, and then Ryan's organization in the Ottawa region, which is the capital of Canada, or sorry, it is the capital of Canada, it's where our parliament is. That organization, Power, distributed $12,000 to the local community in, I think they were $100 honorariums. And in our community of Hamilton, which is about 560,000 people in general, we distributed $4,600 in honorariums. And for doing that process, we were kind of right on the front lines of people beginning to panic and really not understand how sex workers and the community itself was going to cope with the incoming lockdowns, the loss of work, the loss of income. And from this, we saw that there was a real uncertainty of whether the rolling out of government benefits were going to include sex workers. So the main kind of government benefits in Canada at the time that came out, I believe April 2020, was the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. And there was a secondary one that was rolled out later called the Canadian Emergency Student Benefit. In its broadly struck, it was to support workers who had been laid off or lost work, and it worked in tandem with our unemployment insurance to supply them with up to $2,000 a month in lost wages. So right away, there was uncertainty in the community whether sex workers would be considered eligible for this program. And there was a lot of confusion with sex worker organizations and within us within our own organizations too, about whether or not the CERB and CESB, which I'll refer to throughout the presentation, whether they were inclusive of sex workers or not. So that's just a little bit about our background. And then Ryan saw a grant opportunity for a grant that would provide up to $25,000 towards a project related to COVID-19 through our national funding body that's related to social science and humanities research. At the time, Ryan and I were both postdoctoral fellows at different universities in Canada, and we decided that summer of 2020 to give the project a try. And we worked in collaboration with Chris Bruckert at the University of Ottawa, as well as two other community members who were volunteers at Power, Zoe Jones and Madeline Goodman. And Power itself was our partner organization. So wanted to thank all those folks for their work, and also quickly just thank Yelena Vermillion and Christian Garcia, who worked with me on those mutual aid grants in Hamilton as well. So I'll pass it over to Ryan, who will give you a little bit of background about the project that we ended up doing.
Great. So I'll keep it quick and short. And if there's questions about nitty-gritty of methodology, we can answer that in the Q&A. But in short, we wanted to collect information about sex workers' tax filing habits, because the possibility to have access to the CERB and the CESB was that you had filed taxes and had claimed at least $5,000 of income. So we developed a survey to do with sex workers. The survey was developed in partnership with Power, members of Power's board, and all throughout the process, everything was run back and forth between the researchers and folks at Power. So we produced a bilingual online survey in the spring of 2021. So a little bit different from some of the other research that was like really when COVID started. There was crises, mutual aid projects came out, but this is a bit later when the government of Canada had produced actually a significant number of rather hardy government benefit plans for workers who lost income. And so our survey was a bit lengthy, 57 questions, but we were trying to capture lots of information. And we had 287 respondents who completed the survey. And our outreach process was through word of mouth, social networks, everything was done online, but we also hired a few people from the community, specifically within micro communities within the larger community, like someone who worked in the massage sector and someone who worked with male sex workers and someone who worked in the dance bars, to make sure that we had outreach across all sorts of sectors. And it really paid off. It worked wonderfully. And also part of this research project that was really important is that every respondent to the survey, we sent $50 by e-transfer. So it was also about redistributing wealth. And so 200 respondents, $50, we gave a lot of people money. We doubled the amount of money that Power was able to give by doing this research grant. And for the people that couldn't take digital e-transfers because they didn't have bank accounts, I was on my bicycle riding around handing out envelopes of cash to people. hopefully Shirk didn't just hear that. They might be upset about that, but here we are. So just quickly, just to talk about the demographic data, just to get a sense of who we spoke to. Our data demographics really reflected the workers, the information that we already knew, but it reaffirms, right? Majority of workers were women. We're a city that's 65% white, 60% of our respondents were white, the rest were people of color. And so the data is pretty good. Majority younger people, mostly under 30, almost all under 40. Most of our respondents were in English. For folks that don't know, we're in a sort of bilingual place where we offered the survey in French and English, but majority English respondents. About 15% identified as chronically ill or disabled. And nearly all of our respondents were either Canadian residents, Canadian citizens or permanent residents. So we did not capture data around migrant sex workers, and the number of people that weren't permanent residents were mostly international students. And the one other piece of data I want to share in terms of demographics is that less than half of our respondents identified as heterosexual, and nearly 37% were identified as transgender. So we're going to come back to that data around queer and trans people in the sex industry when we come back to our conclusions, but just noting that as significant. And the last thing I'll say about demographic data is that we had people from across all sectors. It was very widely represented, from indoor workers, outdoor workers, street-based, survival sex, massage, dance, etc. We had everybody. So I'll pass it back to Emma for the next set.
Great, thanks, Ryan. So just to follow up, we were successful in getting the grant. So we did receive $23,170, I believe, for this grant. So that's where the funds came from for us to do this this survey and to hand redistribute at least $13,000 to community members in the Ottawa-Gatineau region. So from the get-go, our study was not really interested in the health impacts of COVID-19, or we knew that there were going to be significant health impacts as well as mental health impacts, but we were really looking at this from a political economy perspective to get a sense of the real economic effects of the loss of work for sex workers from March 2020 to July 2021 when the survey closed. And in that, we realized that this piece about taxes was really important because accessing those funds that were available through the government, as Ryan mentioned, hinged on having filed taxes in 2019. So there's a lot of, I guess there's a myth around sex work and taxes that we encountered in our community-based organizing, which was that sex workers didn't file taxes, so it was really unlikely they'd be able to access these support systems. And then, so that became, we put that into our survey as, you know, let's get a sense of whether or not people are filing their taxes and what people's relationship is like to these state apparatuses. And we were quite surprised by our results, which was that from our survey respondents, we found that 74.4% of our respondents reported that they did indeed file their taxes every year. And what was interesting was that 66% of folks who filed claimed their income from sex work. So it kind of busted that myth right at the beginning that sex workers weren't filing taxes. And so while there were, you know, about 17% who didn't, it was interesting for us to begin to think about that. And we got really interesting feedback from our respondents around why they did and why they didn't. But it became critical when we began to look at the data with people who'd actually received CERB, that piece around the majority filing income tax mattered. And in turn, about 48% of our respondents actually did receive CERB, and of that, 16% also received the student support, and 22% received employment insurance. So this was all to show that even prior to the pandemic, 41% of our respondents had already been accessing social support networks. So they had been accessing EI, disability support payments, or welfare. So they already were interfacing with the government through financial support in particular ways that relied on income declaration, not necessarily always an accurate reflection of income, but some kind of income reporting was happening. So yeah, and Ryan, do you want to weigh in? Should we jump into the kind of difficulty of that finding at all? Do you want to chat a little bit about that? you want to go?
Yeah, let's talk about the difficulty, because we've got about 2 minutes, so I'll try to keep it really short.
Yeah.
One of the difficulties is that we found data that our partner agency wasn't super excited about, and the framing that the sex worker rights movement in Canada used in terms of seeking redress from the federal government to get more funding for their organizations was that sex workers were excluded from the CERB. And that's because they don't file taxes. And our data was an exact contradiction of this, which is sex workers are part of the social fabric of our society, and they're a diverse group of people, and most of them file their taxes, and some of them have mortgages, and lots of them have children and pay rent and access Social Security, right? All these things that like you don't have access to if you don't do your taxes. So it put us in an awkward position of having written a report that is contradictory to the sort of politically expedient folk wisdom claims of the sex worker rights movement that suggests sex workers are sort of outside the social fabric of society, and don't participate in the sort of civic duty of paying taxes. And so that was a bit of an uncomfortable piece for us, and sort of ended up in us not publishing our report in the end. So this data is mostly unpublished. But one of the arguments that I think is important that Emma and I always came back to is that from the outset, we always thought a universal basic income guarantee was the solution to this problem, even before we had data that suggested the problem wasn't exactly what we thought it was. And this is particularly important in light of the clawbacks that are happening with the federal government in Canada, where they're trying to claw back CERB and CESB funds because people applied for the wrong programs or got an extra payment that they shouldn't have gotten. And so for us, it's like, why don't you just make this the consistent constant as the universal basic income guarantee, so that we don't have to roll out these new programs all the time? And I'll send it back to Emma for the last 30 seconds.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So yeah, just in terms of working with community, we didn't publish this report because our partner organization in the end didn't want us to. And in terms of this project, always from the beginning being about putting money into sex workers' hands, the results weren't, they're important, but that wasn't why we did this project. We did it to support the community financially in this time of crisis. And we are super interested in this long-term and these questions long-term around economics, but we'll see where that goes. And we hope other folks will continue to pick up that research. But as members of the LGBTQ2TS community, what we really want to hit home is that LGBTQ organizations should be taking up the work of decriminalization and should be taking up the work of supporting sex workers and recognizing sex workers are a major part of their communities, including their organizations and their volunteer work and all of that, and put the justice for sex workers at the front of their organizing needs moving forward. That's really important for us, that it's not just sex workers and their allies doing this work, but that the LGBTQ community recognizes sex workers as integral to the community as well.
Thank you so much, Emma, and to all the panelists for your presentations and very critical research that you're conducting. We will transition now to the Q&A portion of the event. And I'm going to open up the first question we have to all panelists. And the question is, what's the most important thing you want attendees to take away from what you presented today? So maybe we'll start in the order that we presented. So with Megan and Kate.
Sorry, I'm still just like digesting all of that, which is anyway, I've been working on this panel since September and looking forward so much to hearing all of you talk about your work. So I'm like very psyched to have heard about it. I mean, the first thing I think that comes to mind is just like that sex workers are these rock stars who are doing this incredible work in all of these different places, right? And they're facing incredible amounts of stigma and criminalization. I mean, certainly in the context that Kate and I work in, and yet are managing to help each other. These mutual aid networks, these processes of collective care are just really inspiring to me, and is something that I think is just like the first thing I think of, that I really want people to know about the incredible work that sex workers are doing, and then also know about the incredibly difficult context in which they're able to pull these things off, right? Like it's amazing that they can do it, but maybe that they shouldn't have to work quite this hard. Yeah, Kate, I don't know if you want to add something more articulate to that.
No, that was great. I was going to say something really similar, that sex work is always exceptionalized. And yet usually if you look at sex work, it can tell you so much about other forms of work, about organizing. And what really struck, I think, both of us is that during COVID, people suddenly started talking about mutual aid, and people were like, oh my God, what's mutual aid? Let's find out about mutual aid. And there's now various books by some popular publishers, 3 books out on mutual aid, as if people have just discovered it. And like in the context that Megan and I look at, but everywhere really, sex workers have been doing this, exactly what people suddenly had to discover, for like decades and decades, are doing it really well. So just I come from a work and employment relations background, and this is what I'm always arguing. Like, if you look at sex work, you could have understood the gig economy in Uber like ages ago if you actually paid attention. You could have, you can understand about feminized work, you can understand about informality. And then I think this is just another example where if you take sex work seriously, you can, it's a real lens to look back at other more kind of less marginalized social processes.
It's getting a bit late here in France, so my brain is a bit tired. I feel like the most important is that what I thought was really interesting is when the pandemic started, some of the sex worker group approached their government and asked them for funding. And I'm thinking of Ireland, for example, like Republic of Ireland and France, which has a Swedish model there where clients are criminalized and sex workers are not considered actors in the, in this dialogue. And what was interesting in France, for example, sex workers approached the Minister of Equality and said, we need money now. We literally don't have any money. We can't pay for the hotel room or anything. We need money now. And the government, the Minister of Equality, messaged back, I think, on an interview saying like, it's too complicated. So then sex workers made this kind of ironic threads on Twitter saying like, oh, it's too complicated to support us, but it's not too complicated to criminalize us. And actually, there is this big debate in Europe and globally about the Swedish model and the best way to approach sex work, with part of like the feminist movement and others calling for the criminalization of clients, and are ready to use all these resources to criminalize what is often the only form of income for many people, where actually the money is available. It is possible to support people. We saw during the COVID crisis that it was possible, suddenly in Europe anyway, to house most homeless people. It was possible to find places in hotels and in empty houses to house homeless people. And then there was this sense of hope that, oh, possibly this thing will stay after COVID. And as soon as COVID was more or less over, it was like, oh, now we go back to normal. But with sex workers, it's the same thing. If right now there is a push, people don't want people to sell sex because whatever reason, then make resources available to trans women, to single mother, to students, so that people don't have to engage in sex work in the first place. And I think COVID for us really showed this, is that actually sex workers will look after each other. We would like the state to look after us, but until you do, we will look after ourselves like we always did.
Yeah, I think I'll be very brief. I think the key thing, the takeaway would be, I think the importance of social movement mobilization. I think you can actually see results over time, and that's been the experience of the Indian sex workers movement, that despite being so highly marginalized and despite waves of carceral legislation that have come through, the fact that being able to mobilize on the ground has meant that whichever institution that you access, you're able to apply more pressure, simply because sex workers are very organized. So even in the litigation before the Supreme Court, there were particular states where because sex workers were very active there, they could get the governments to do more in those kind of states. And the fact that you can chip away at some sort of the idea that sex work has always been criminalized in India, and that you could actually incorporate it within a transformative view of the Constitution, I think it just feels very hopeful. And we are actually working with other forms of women's work as well, and have to say that actually the sex workers groups seem to be at the vanguard compared to, say, we were also looking at domestic workers, we're also looking at surrogates, and I think someone's asked the question about dancers. So we were also looking at erotic dancers actually, to see how they were engaging with the state. And it was very clear that the sex workers movement, by being very persistent, is at the vanguard of some of these struggles for social justice.
So I'm speaking, but Emma and I have been colluding behind the scenes to give you an answer. So the main thing we want people to take away from what we presented is that sex workers are like a vastly diverse group of people with a diverse group of needs. And anytime someone talks about sex workers need X or sex workers do this, a red flag should go up because it's a really diverse group of people, and it's really hard to say any one true thing about sex workers since it's such a diverse and dynamic group of people. And in particular, the sort of overrepresentation of street-based and survival sex work in the popular imagination and also within sort of scholarly academic work tends to frame conversations in a particular way about sex work when sex workers are actually a much larger group of people and not just street-based. So yeah, you should always remember sex workers are a really diverse group of people, diverse needs, and there are diverse sets of solutions to deal with issues pertaining to sex work.
And I guess, Emma, do you have anything you'd like to add or any takeaway? No? Okay, that's totally fair. I think a question that would apply to every presentation here more so would be building a little bit off of what Emma and Ryan talked about. You know, each presentation highlight the ways in which sex worker grassroots organizations or just sex workers collectively came together to provide mutual aid and immense forms of support to help sex workers navigate, you know, the financial, legal, emotional, and health precarities caused by COVID-19 pandemic, as well as institutional regulation of sex work during the COVID-19 pandemic. And Emma and Ryan's presentation touched a little bit on how visibility was a key factor for sex workers receiving federally funded support, so CERB, and, you know, filing their taxes and identifying to an institutional way their visibility. So my curiosity here is essentially, how did visibility or invisibility influence sex workers throughout the pandemic in each of your studies, and essentially just the role of visibility and how that played a role in providing mutual aid?
I'll just jump in quick, which is just since it's a global panel. In Canada, you know, we've being a sex worker itself is not illegal. Like selling sex isn't illegal. It's illegal to purchase sexual services right now. So there are within the tax, just speak briefly about taxes, there are categories within taxes involving entertainment, massage, things like that, where people can claim kinds of sex work without this just saying it's sex work. So that's why there's a lot of people who are doing so. And just this is just our study, of course, which we have another an infographic that showed the diversity of the different jobs that people do. But you know, it's you can strip. Stripping is legal. Things like that. So strippers are often, you know, claiming that income on their taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a visibility in the tax system already of this category of workers who are engaging in exotic sexual services. It's not like in Canada, you can't participate in that. So I think that's sort of somewhat of an answer. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I was just going to say that sex workers are always both visible and invisible to the state, but it depends which arm of the state you're talking about. So they tend to be very invisible to the welfare state and agents that are dealing with redistribution, but very visible to the violent arm of the state. And I think that came out quite a lot in the research that was being done in Latin America, because it actually affected how the research was done as well. So, you know, at times when people weren't even supposed to be out of the house, let alone working, there were a few quite dangerous in some ways situations where the people that were either doing outreach or doing the questionnaires, who are often the same people, were having to kind of deal with the armed forces and try and kind of negotiate that sort of visibility and invisibility. So more than ever, they were kind of made to be more visible because no one else is out on the street. And yet, you know, as we've heard over and over again through all these presentations, remained completely invisible when it came to redistribution of wealth.
I think I'll just say that, the Indian context is quite obviously different from the Canadian context. So we don't have a formal form of visibility through, tax mechanisms and so on. And I think it's just the way that the institutional mechanisms are set up. But I think as in the Latin American context, sex workers are very much part of the informal economy. But because the informal economy itself is also invisible in large part, that, then they also become invisible for that reason. But that said, I think there has been a very creative ground up kind of reimagination of labor laws from the perspective of informal workers in many parts of the global South. And I think so there's just a different, the mechanisms for visibility can differ quite a lot rather than have quite typical protections under labor laws. It could be that, certain aspects of labor law protections are prioritized, such as social security. So, to that extent, I think sex workers have always wanted to be construed as being part of the informal economy, not as being, unique in any way. But also it's a period of tremendous sort of labor law upheaval in the Indian context. So there are some quite random exclusions, and the informal economy is again completely rendered invisible. So there's a deep tug of war in a federal system. I think that also matters a lot, how the systems are set up. So like the Canadian system, I think we have a kind of complicated federal mechanism. So you may be invisible at the federal level, but a lot of visibility might come from the state level. So I think all those levers of visibility and invisibility need to be taken into consideration when you're thinking about sex workers.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for probably one more question. One of the questions posed is, what are ways in which sex workers themselves, these organizations, your projects, other researchers aim to educate the public and policymakers on the realities of sex work and the importance of protecting the rights of sex workers and having sex workers' lived experiences being acknowledged? And this is again open to anyone.
Happy to say a few words. I feel being part of a sex worker-led organization, what is really critical is to support through funding, but also to partnership, sex worker-led organizations. So there's always been organizations that want to support sex workers one way or another, sometimes by like one of the questions, like encourage them to exit the sex industry or providing alternatives. And they usually have received support from the state, but there's very few sex worker-led organizations that do receive support by like a government. So I think it's very important to support sex worker-led organization, and that can be like a small collective of street-based sex workers like we have, or it can be a national organization, a regional network, and a global network. And I feel like it's very important to educate yourself about the history of the sex workers' rights movement. As many people have said before, like sex workers' rights have been organizing for decades, often in very difficult and dangerous and precarious environments. And they're actually an example, like the sex worker rights movement can teach a lot to other part of the labor rights movement, to other feminist movement, about the way to organize as undocumented migrants, as precarious people that bring so many issues. And in particular on the issue of tax and the role of labor contract and stigma, there's so many like layers that can be explored, but that has to be done in partnership with sex workers. So I feel like that everybody has some form of power and privilege, whether you are a student or involved in like a feminist organization or trade union or a researcher or funder, you do have access to some area where you can bring the voices of sex workers, and you should never like create spaces talking about sex workers without sex workers there. And I do feel that we are, maybe I'm being a bit optimistic as we see things shifting a bit in Europe. I do think we are seeing the worst of the abolitionist movement criminalizing sex work. I think there's been so much evidence that the Swedish model is not working, that we now have more opportunities to bring voices of sex workers and more at the forefront in the media, in the policy field. So each time it's engaging with sex workers, and that means effort. And I feel sometimes that's something that people don't want to do. It's like, it means reaching out to sex workers, having conversations, sometimes difficult conversations about your own power and privileges in society in order to have true, meaningful collaboration with sex workers.
I'll I'll say quickly, not to this is not about ego, but if you are a student and a scholar and you're thinking about doing research in collaboration with sex workers, Emma and I also produced another publication from this project about our process and our methodology about collaborating with other sex workers and sex worker-led social movements when doing research in the academy. And we are not the only people to have thought of thinking about writing about this kind of stuff, but it's just one example. And we break it down into 10 very simple questions of like, if you're thinking about doing research with sex worker organizations or sex worker activists, these are some things you should think about. And that I think is a useful outcome from our project, is that Emma and I just reflected and hope that's useful to other people. So if you're thinking as a student, that's something you can email Emma and I will email it to you. You don't have to pay for an overpriced Routledge book. You can get it from us.
I was just going to say something very similar in that to what Luca was saying in terms of just making sure that sex workers' voices somehow go directly to policymakers. So in Argentina, when sex workers first started organizing, they would literally physically go to senators' offices and just bang on the door and then make them come out and just start telling them the realities of their lives and just shouting at them and saying, this is what the police do to us, this is how many times we're arrested. And it's pretty hard to ignore when you have people, physically in front of you. It's obviously not always possible for some sex workers to do that in person or to use their own names or faces. So just finding different ways of making sure that there's a direct link between policymakers and sex workers' voices. For example, that's why Megan and I wanted to use the video today, so it's not just being refracted through us. Or, for example, if I'm ever invited to speak to something, I always ask first, who else have you asked first? I'm not really comfortable doing it if you haven't approached, at least tried, quite hard to get sex worker organizations involved, and that's really who you should be speaking to. So just thinking at each time, what's the best way for having that kind of direct access between people who make these decisions and sex workers themselves.
Yeah, I think I'll just say that, all these are all just wonderful suggestions. And, so we recently organized a debate between a woman who's an abolitionist, but we were trying to understand sex work through the lens of caste, which, is not often done in the Indian context. And we wanted to kind of rethink it. And so we had a woman who's a Dalit feminist, and we had sex workers there. And it was the value of debate, right? I mean, we're used to thinking about this in some very in terms of a caricature, but the debate as it panned out showed how graceful the sex workers were. Although everything they were saying was being, the woman kept saying in the chat box that they were subject to false consciousness. She kept saying this, kept interrupting them, kept talking over them. The grace with which the sex workers actually simply invited her to come be amongst them. I mean, it was just so disarming. So I think actually one needs to do very little. I think if you invite sex workers to the conversation, they have very powerful ways of engaging with these kinds of, any kind of abolitionists or any kind of anti-sex work kind of argument. And I think we're seeing also culturally these debates have to happen. I mean, they have to enter the mainstream. I mean, and there's been a recent Bollywood biopic on a sex worker leader in Bombay, and I think sometimes these are the ways in which conversations happen also around sex work, not just in sort of academic and activist spaces, but also has to happen at book fairs. Calcutta sex workers go to book fairs every year, and they just speak to the public, directly. And so I think there are lots of creative ways in which to have these conversations.
I just wanted to also quickly add, I was thinking about Emma and Ryan talking about the way that their research showed that sex workers are just like part of our communities, right? That one of the stories from our fieldwork was that Samantha Carrillo, who's a Guatemalan leader, talked about how they were out distributing packets of food to sex workers. And of course, other people came because they were like, oh shit, you're like giving out food, here we are to collect them. And that they were like, that's fine. We're willing to support everybody, but you're going to know that this is brought to you by sex workers, right? And so they were constantly, even as they were practicing mutual aid beyond the sex work community, they were also doing this work to combat stigma, to talk about, what sex work was, what the language we prefer that you use is, and connecting as like, I'm an informal worker, you're an informal worker, right? So just that piece that Kate was also talking about earlier about sort of de-exceptionalizing sex work as something so separate from the work that other folks are doing, I think is really, really important.
Well, I just want to end off by thanking each and every one of you for speaking today, for all the attendees for coming. I want to thank Carol Payne for the land acknowledgement and opening up the event, and the comms team at ODFASS for all their support, as well as Megan for organizing this event.
And thank you, Michelle Leslie, for moderating.
Thank you for having me.